In modern-day discussion of narrative media, the term realism is often used as a reason for praise or criticism. This holds up easily enough for drama, crime, or historical fiction. All of these aim for a relatively one-on-one representation of the real world, even considering alterations made for entertainment purposes. But what does realism mean, and when does it matter for an animated film, and for sci-fi and fantasy narratives, all of which are not real by definition? First, let's find out what is realism in the first place. In reference to art, film, and literature, Oxford Dictionary defines it as a close resemblance to what is real, a fidelity of representation, rendering the precise details of the real thing or scene. For realism to happen, a media text must adhere to something, the real thing. We run into an immediate problem with animation, fantasy, and sci-fi. Surely we can think of films in these genres that feel realistic without resembling our world very closely. Take Avatar: The Last Airbender, a show that first doesn't look like real life, second doesn't work like real life, and third feels completely realistic. One reason is that no media text is ever just one thing that we can judge as either realistic or unrealistic. We should first identify two kinds of beliefs. Beliefs about what we see and hear, take Tintin, a film that looks very real, and beliefs about the story, take The Garden of Words. Here the story is very realistic. We can identify more categories within audiovisual and story information. Yale University's model for film criticism provides us with this list. If we add some more elements for animation and fantasy sci-fi specifically, and then organize it into our first two categories, we get the following model. So, does that answer our question? A little bit. For instance, part of why Avatar: The Last Airbender feels real is because parts of it are. The art style is relatively realistic, and we find lifelike characters within this fantasy world. They have strengths and faults, they're serious at times, goofy at others.
I sense he's filled with much wisdom.
See? Now it's Thomas that can like dance.
And the plot explores real-life issues like sexist attitudes and imperialism. In the live-action film, although it features real people, Aang, Katara, and Sokka act serious throughout the whole film and don't play around much, if at all. This makes them one-sided plot devices and very unlike real human beings, despite their greater physical resemblance to humans. Evidently, maintaining certain realistic elements can make a fantasy seem real, but what about when a magic system feels realistic, or a dragon? Perhaps it's a tie to the real world, not so much as an adherence to it. Again, take Avatar. Another part of why this show works so well is because it builds on things we know about reality. Element bending is based on martial arts, and just like bending, these martial arts revolve around energy regulation. This grants us a crutch, a presupposed sense of logic and familiarity to what is an essentially impossible magic system. Such ties can make fantasy way easier to believe, and again, The Last Airbender fails in this regard. The direction and weight of the bender's movements often don't match the direction and weight of the bending, and the culture around bending is less visible. We see less training, less meditating, less context. So, ties to the real world make a story more realistic. Still, we're left with a problem. Vampires. Yeah, vampires. We can identify more and less realistic vampires, but why is an onion-fearing vampire less realistic than a garlic-fearing one? They're similar enough that neither has a strong tie to the real world or a distinguishing element that puts one closer to reality than the other. It has to do with this. We have knowledge about vampires. As Eva Schaper asserts in her 1978 paper, we can believe things without committing to their existence. We can believe that vampires drink blood without ever having to believe they're real. In other words, a vampire hating garlic might not adhere to literal reality, but it does adhere to the reality of vampirism. It's a cultural piece of knowledge. This holds true for something less factual like filming conventions. We are not surprised by Bugs Bunny defying gravity, because we're used to that in Looney Tunes type cartoons. It adheres to the reality of genre convention. We know they're not really capable of floating in mid-air, but it's just an accepted way of exaggerating events. Schaper concludes that we always have to be aware that we're consuming a story. We need beliefs about film as film in order to have beliefs about the story it tells, because cultural context, film conventions, iconography, etc. give us information about what we're seeing. We can gather from this that different types of realism exist. Some adhere to reality and some to cultural knowledge or convention. But when we look at Alice in Wonderland, something is still off. Neither in reality nor in animation is it a given for little girls to grow 10 times their size from eating a cookie. When this does happen to Alice, however, our conclusion is not how unrealistic, but rather Wonderland plays by these cookie rules. What's more, when Alice eats another cookie, we expect her to change size again. Clearly, there is another type of realism to identify, one that adheres to narrative context. The above is completely dependent on build-up. In the notoriously horrible film The Room, the characters often feel like aliens. They react in the wrong emotional tone to the wrong things, too quickly or too slowly. Look at this scene in a flower shop, for instance.
Hi.
Can I help you?
Yeah, can I have a dozen red roses, please?
Oh, hi, Johnny. I didn't know it was you. Here you go.
That's me. How much is it?
It'll be $18.
Here you go. Keep the change. Hi, doggy.
You're my favorite customer.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye-bye.
We could take this to mean that characters who don't behave like real people are unrealistic characters, but that isn't necessarily the case. In Alice in Wonderland, we find a similar kind of strangeness in the Mad Tea Party. The Mad Hare and the Mad Hatter answer Alice's questions in a strange, roundabout way, and despite their constant insistence, they never let Alice take a sip of her tea.
Would you like a little more tea?
Well, I haven't had any yet, so I can't very well take more.
Ah, you mean you can't very well take less?
This behaviour, however, seems completely fitting in the narrative. The difference is that the Mad Hatter's absurdness has a purpose in the story and adheres to the context of Wonderland. Johnny's absurdness in The Room, on the other hand, isn't fitting at all for the context. Romantic drama, a genre that adheres pretty closely to real life. Neither do we find any reason within the film as to why social conventions would work differently here. Narrative context realism heavily relies on what the author tells and shows us, and on how the rest of the narrative holds up in relation to that. So, even for animation, sci-fi and fantasy, this is realism, an adherence to one of three types of context. First, narrative realism, second, convention realism, and third, real-life realism. If an element of a story is not built up, it should be known by the viewer through convention, and if it's not known by convention, it should adhere to real life. Films that don't adhere to real life can be made more realistic through first maintaining separate elements that are real-life realistic, and maintaining ties to real life in elements that aren't. Going back to Oxford, fidelity of representation might be a very accurate way of describing it. Portraying something in a faithful way, that is, faithful to its own roots and to the viewer's roots. Then, why does it matter? Now we know what realism is, but what is the purpose of it? First of all, immersion. Every second we are preoccupied with the realism of a film, we are not preoccupied with the story. We will notice if a film is unrealistic because we are experts on what we are used to, and this will take up our attention. While we are always aware of the screen because it provides us with information, immersion can only happen when the screen moves to the background and the story is our main focus. Moreover, when a character is believable, we are more likely to care about them, and therefore more likely to care in general. If we care about a film, we want to continue watching. Second, social commentary. As stated by Paul Wells, animation is uniquely suited to social commentary because of its coupled distance from and resemblance to reality. Quote, Felix the cat did not live in the real world, and thus he could operate outside its moral and ideological constraints. Sometimes Felix's environment was significantly enough like the real world, however, for him to represent alternative and radical agendas. Animation legitimized the social and political ambivalence of such narratives by simultaneously approximating some of the conditions of real existence, whilst distancing itself from them by recourse to the unique aspects of its own vocabulary. In that vein, realism matters a great deal. It can ground us and direct our attention away from the image and towards the story. This leaves room for the story, but also for its meaning. It creates a playing field for exploring complex real-world issues. If we can't find resemblance, if we can't believe in a story, it will just be a bad metaphor instead of a relevant point of discussion. So, be mindful of consistency. This holds true for typically real genres, like drama. Keeping a film consistent will always make it more realistic. And if you are aware of where exactly that realism presides, you can see where you have the freedom to take a step away from it, and where you might be able to say something meaningful about the world. Really, this is freedom. We can do anything we want in a story, anything we think of, as long as we put it in a fitting place.